Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Chimoge's comments. I'm Chimoge. Obviously, I don't know who else I would be. And this is another commentary reaction video. Please, this video is going to be going out on multiple platforms as always. So, please, like and subscribe or follow on whatever platform you're viewing it on, whether it be YouTube, Facebook, or whatever else. And yeah, thank you for tuning in once again. So today the video I'm going to be reacting to is from the channel of Ben Shapiro, a prominent conservative commentator. And it looks like it's an interview he did with Bill Maher, who is a prominent comedian and political commentator, who is liberal, but I guess you could call him I don't know, a moderate liberal, a liberal with some conservative tendencies. Um, you know, I it's hard to find an exact word for the type of liberal he is. However, I know it's a very particular type of archetype of liberal, and I'll break that down in a future video. But just for those of you who don't know, that's the kind of person he is. So, like, he's the kind of person who votes Democrat, but then will decry things like identity politics, which of course is actually the topic they're going over. So just to give anyone who doesn't know a general idea of where these guys stand, um, and they're also they've both courted controversy for um, bigoted statements in the past and stances. I don't remember, to be fair, I don't remember specific um, incidents with Ben Shapiro, but I know there have been several. Bill Maher, on the other hand, I can recall specific incidents. There was most famously the incidents where he said the N word live on TV. He got in big trouble for that, among other things. I think Ben Shapiro's got in trouble for saying some things about transgender people. Don't quote me on that, but I know he's been in some trouble. But anyway, this is the kind of people these are. So, um, the title of the video is Bill Maher's Thoughts on Identity Politics. I'll link to it below. Um, and yeah, it looks like a snippet from a longer interview. It's about 5 minutes. But let's take a look and I'll tell you what I think.
So one of the things I think that we're speaking about here is the attempt to turn everything into an identity. And so if you are Adele is bad because she shed her identity as an overweight singer for a new identity as just a singer who's not overweight. And there's this feeling about nearly everything in American life. Everything can be boiled down to an issue of identity. And the problem with that, of course, on a broader political level, is once everything's an identity, including your political perspective, every political argument becomes an attack on you as a person. Because if your identity is your politics, and then I disagree with your politics, that's not us having a rational debate. That's me attacking your character. That's me saying you're a bad person. It's me trying to unperson you. You hear this sort of language all the time in a variety of issues. You're trying to erase me as a human being. If I disagree with you, obviously the most obvious example is on transgenderism, where the argument is that if you don't want Leah Thomas, the biologically male swimmer, swimming against women, this is because you're trying to erase Leah Thomas's transgender identity. Like, once everything becomes an identity, even putting that as example aside, then it prohibits you from actually having rational conversations with people. The entire basis of rational conversation is my identity.
Okay, I was looking for a more natural place to pause it, where maybe Ben Shapiro would stop talking and take a breath, but then I forgot it's Ben Shapiro. He never stops talking or takes breaths. So I'm just gonna stop it there. But yeah, he said a lot there in that 1 minute that I think was kind of off. First of all, the idea of everything being an identity, if you get down to that on a deeper philosophical level, and perhaps what I'm about to say is somewhat semantic, but I do think it is important. Every aspect of a person's being is a part of their identity. by definition, because your identity is you. That's who you are, right? So everything, your opinion, your race, your gender, whatever, is an aspect of your identity. So on some level, um, we don't make everything an identity. If we're being technical, everything is just an aspect of identity. And you could say it is an identity just by the nature of existence. So saying that's a problem, I think, is flawed. Now, I do, to some extent, understand what he might be trying to say when he says that, and to some extent, I agree in that not every aspect of identity is equally um, politically relevant, or more specifically, equally oppressed. Because usually um, this conversation comes up in dialogue about oppression. So, for example, people will increasingly say things like, for example, you know, being fat is part of my identity, and therefore, if you criticize me for being fat, that's oppression. Fat people are oppressed. It's just as bad as racism, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a flawed argument, because while there is certainly unjust discrimination against fat people in certain aspects of life, the nature of being fat is not the same as the nature of being a man, the nature of being a woman, the nature of being black, the nature of being um, East Asian, for example. So the exact nuances of even what constitutes oppression when dealing with those identities is not going to be the same, right? So um, it, and certainly if you're looking at things both over with a historical lens, and then also through the lens of contemporary social science indicators, you can't claim that people have been attacked for being fat to the same degree that people have been attacked for being, say, black over the course of history, and then in the modern day, right? So that's just one example without going too deep into that, because I don't want to make the video all about that specific example. When people make things an identity, as he's saying, they can be pushing a flawed way of looking at and evaluating various aspects of identity, and and dealing with the problems people may face on account of those identities. So I understand that. However, as I said before, to say that those markers are not identities or not aspects of identity is just on a technical level not quite accurate. Then going even further than that, what he seemed to insinuate throughout that clip is that um, politics shouldn't be based upon one's identity, but that is nonsensical. And this is what really annoys me most with the discourse of people who are against identity politics. Because, again, inherently, all politics is based on identity. Politics, because there is a discussion to be had about how you even define politics. And personally, I think politics is such a broad thing that, like, literally everything is political. So to some extent, it doesn't even um, make sense to talk about politics as its own separate thing. That's just life. That's a larger discussion. But if you want to define politics somewhat narrowly as the process of, governing society, or, making sure that everyone gets their needs met, if you want to describe it somewhat narrowly as that, all that stuff is going to be based on the identities of the people involved. Because societies are going to be governed by people, and those people doing the governing are going to be governing other people. So the identities of everyone involved and everything attached to that is inherently linked to that. Same with if you want to distribute resources, right? These resources are going to be distributed by certain individuals to other individuals based upon their needs. All that stuff is linked to identity. So this idea that like you can have a politics without identity, it's nonsense. That's like saying that you can have gravity without force. It just doesn't make any fucking sense. Um, and yeah, it's just really absurd on a philosophical level. And then one other thing, I think the other thing he said there was the idea that when everything is made an identity and then we're all doing identity politics, then we can't have a rational discussion because everyone feels personally attacked. There is a kernel of truth in that when people, part of what he is alluding to is how a lot of people will think that their philosophical ideas and opinions are inextricably linked to their personhood and their ability to have rights as a person. So then, if those things get challenged, instead of engaging in the discussion rationally and calmly, they'll react irrationally, and then you can't have a discussion. I would agree with that. However, more broadly, the full idea he expressed that you can't have any sort of rational discussion if people um, think their identities are important in a political or philosophical discussion, again, is absurd. Um, you can, I mean, inherently, you have to, if you're having a discussion, on some level, say, hey, my identity or the identities of the people we're discussing are somehow relevant in this, right? So you can do that. And again, logically, you have to. And then also hear people out on their ideological opinion. So again, what he just said there in that minute and 10 seconds of word salad was just layer upon layer of nonsense, with all due respect to him. So let's keep going.
It doesn't matter. What I'm arguing up here with you is what matters.
Yeah, I would agree with all that, but I would ask you if you would agree that there's certainly a lot of that on the right too. What is more of an identity than the Trump voter, the white person who thinks that America is being taken away and becoming a different kind of country than they remember it? Let's make America great again, wink, wink, white again. I mean, that is also a type of identity politics.
And Bill Maher, I have to say, is actually spot on there. Bill Maher is someone I certainly do not agree with everything he says. I mean, end of the day, just another racist white dude. But a lot of the time, he is also on point, and he is on point there. A lot of conservatives, like Ben Shapiro, try and act like only liberals are doing this identity politics. But as Bill Maher quite eloquently pointed out, conservatives are doing it to the same extent. It just there may be different identities they're advocating for. And when I do my lecture, breaking down liberalism and conservatism, I'll talk about more of why that is. But certainly, it's clear that conservatives, like the Trump voters used as an example, are engaging in political action based upon their identities and what they think is relevant to that. So, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, for the people who actually believe that,
Well,
sure.
a lot of people.
I mean, but I wonder how much of that is reading into somebody else's politics, your desired, character flaw. Meaning, you see that on the right doing that to the left too. I mean, there have been good studies showing that people on the right tend to think that people on the left don't care about family, people on the left don't care about personal values, and then when you actually ask people on the left what they care about a lot of those things.
Right.
And on the left, you see the same thing with the right. If you voted for Trump, it's because you want to make America white again. It's not because you're concerned about, for example, taking the immigration issue. Let's say you're not concerned about the race of immigration. You're worried about how people are going to vote once they move here and how that changes the legal structure of the system, or you're worried about the income level or education.
Okay. So, Ben Shapiro, some of what he said there makes some sense in that, uh, I guess that, the right is not a monolith. They don't all think exactly what Bill Maher said in his example, although I don't know if Bill Maher was saying they all think exactly the same. But again, those other thoughts are still identity politics because those people have decided how they should move politically based upon something relative to their identity and the identities of the other people they're interacting with. That is just an inherent facet of life. I'm probably going to be saying this over and over because it's just such a basic philosophical point, for one thing. And then another thing, just a small thing, he seems to insinuate here that someone could be worried about immigration without being worried about the race of immigrants, and use the example of they're just worried about how the immigrants are going to vote when they get here. Well, I mean, race is highly related to your voting behavior. The two political parties have different racial demographics in the U.S. And even the white people who control each party belong to different tribes, which are really sub races. Again, that's a concept I'm going to get into more in a future video. But again, you're just off there. That's still going to be a racial concern. But let's keep listening.
Education level of people moving here, those are not the same thing as the skin color of the person. So
no, and immigration is an issue.
This is another small thing. Race is much deeper than skin color. Skin color is highly correlated to race in many cases, but it's deeper than that. So that's just a little pet peeve when people of mine, when people dismiss race as though it's just skin color. Like, no, it's your ancestry.
Where I think the Democrats are really not getting it. I mean, they're losing the Hispanic vote.
It's an amazing thing.
Along the border in Texas. Their idea, again, it's sort of your point about identity politics. Their conception, I think, and it's wrong, is that every Latino in America is thinking, boy, more immigration. That would be the best thing. And a lot of them are thinking, no, I'm here.
Yeah.
The last thing I want is someone else coming over who's going to do my job for a little less money.
Bill Maher makes an interesting point there about the thoughts of Latino voters and the strategy of the Democrats. However, he does also miss another key point. To give him credit, he is right that Latinos are not necessarily as pro-immigrant and pro-immigration as popular culture might have you believe. There is a significant percentage of them that do not want more immigrants coming into the country, even though they themselves are either immigrants or the children or grandchildren of immigrants. That is true. And to some extent, when the Democrats play up immigration as part of their strategy, hold on, it looks like my video is paused. Give me a second. Sorry. Oop. All right, y'all get a insider's view as to how I make these things. All right, we're back. All right, cool. Sorry about that brief technical difficulty, but anyway, as I was saying, it is true that to an extent, when the Democrats play up the degree to which they're going to increase immigration rates into the country or advocate for the rights of immigrants, that does hurt them significantly with that segment of Latino voters. That is true. However, he's missing a couple key points. One is that those Latinos he's talking about are white, right? So then the because what we have to realize is that Latino or Hispanic or Latinx, Latin American, whatever you want to call it, that category of people, that's not a race. That just means essentially that um, you come from a country south of the U.S. border that speaks Spanish or Portuguese, depending on whether or not people include Brazil. That is really all it is. But people from those countries belong to all different races, all different racial makeups, and that significantly influences their politics. So the group of Latinos that Bill Maher is talking about are white, and they just have a racist white mentality. The other Latinos they don't want coming in are the ones who are so-called indigenous, right? Native American, and really those people are a mix of black and Asian. If you go really deep into the history, but that's another deeper conversation which I'll have in the future. So anyway, those are the races of Latinos that the white Latinos don't want coming in, as well as black Latinos, right? Because we know there are a lot of those Afro Latinos, and to a lesser extent Asian Latinos, right? Just non-white Latinos they don't want coming in, right? Because to some extent they left their countries to flee them, right? Um, so anyway, the flip side of what I'm saying is that the non-white Latinos generally are very pro-immigrant, right? So it Bill Maher seemed to have been implying, or might have accidentally implied that like most Latinos in general, regardless of their race, are kind of anti-immigrant, but that's not true, right? Um, and this gets into my second point, which is that he thinks that Democrats are, um, being strategically inept by advocating so much for more immigration because of how it upsets those white Latinos. And then I don't know if he'll say it, but I know he said in the past, I anticipate he'd say it again, just other whites in general living in the country. However, they're not, because the strategy of the Democratic Party is to do a delicate dance where they can get as many votes from as many different sectors of the U.S. population as possible so they can barely beat the Republicans in the election. Because the Republicans is the party of the white masses. Most white people are Republican, period, right? So if the Democrats were trying to, um, straight up beat the Republicans in the white vote, they would lose every time. They might as well just stay home every election. They would never win. Um, However, right, what the Democrats realize they can do is they can take the minority of white people that will consistently vote for them, and then also maybe get some independent white people who go back and forth between Republican and Democrat, and get non-whites to vote for them, right? And then in doing that, they can barely edge the election, right? Now, the tricky thing about that is obviously non-whites and whites have very different objectives, right? So then, in order to get both of those groups to vote for you, you kind of have to talk out of two sides of your mouth, and that's what they're doing. So then they go to the non-whites and say things like, "Oh, we want racial justice, more immigration, blah blah blah." And they go to the whites, um, and even among the whites, there are different segments of whites they have to talk to. Um, the most elite whites, who are the ones who rule the Democratic Party, aren't really bothered by this talk of more immigration and more racial justice, because they're the ones um, enacting the Democratic Party agenda anyway. And they also understand that that's all a ruse, right? They don't actually intend to make things better for the non-whites, but they're in on the joke. Not that, well, it's not a joke. They're in on the deception, whereas the less elite whites who tend to vote Republican are not, which is part of why they get upset. But also, to the extent that the most elite whites are earnest, the downsides of those policies, those pro non-white policies, if you will, from a white perspective, are going to be borne by, lower tribe and less elite whites. Like, for example, it's no accident that most of the black people in the country live in the South, which is where the poorest whites live. They don't live around the richest whites in New England or even most of California, right? So if you're gonna, and it's the same thing with other non-white groups, especially the so-called Latinos, non-white Latinos, who again are really, I mean, they're most of them are technically black, just a little bit, but if you want to consider them a different category for the purpose of understanding, fine. But those people, right? Um, right, most of those people also will live around the poor whites. So if more of them come in, right, these most elite whites aren't really going to see their lives change because they're not going to be living around them, right? So anyway, the point I'm making is that rhetoric doesn't bother the most elite whites as much, but however, that minority of lower tribe poor whites that might vote Democrat, that does bother them. So then they will try and not go too far when talking about what they're going to do for the non-whites, and then they will also may sprinkle some stuff in about how they don't want things to change too much to the poor whites, less elite whites, lower tribe whites, those people. So I say all this to say that the message of the Democrats is kind of confusing in each direction. It seems like they're not going far enough. And to someone like Bill Maher, who is an intelligent person. Even though I disagree with him, I think he's, morally reprehensible in a number of ways. But, I'm not gonna say he's unintelligent. So don't think I'm throwing shade with this particular comment. But to someone like Bill Maher, who hasn't analyzed the issue deeply enough, when observing Democratic political behavior, it could look like they're just bad strategists, but they're not. It could look like they're just pussies. I wanted to censor myself for a second. I thought, why not? Hopefully they don't demonetize this. But anyway, well, I'm not even monetizing it. What the hell am I talking about? Anyway, it might look to someone like Bill Maher like the Democrats are just being pussies, but they're not. This is just a very carefully crafted strategy to deceive as many people as possible so they get votes. But anyway, let's go back to the video.
And, I wonder when this is going to sink in the Democratic Party leadership.
I think it's going to be very difficult for them because I think that there is a sort of...
It's never going to sink in because, as I just explained, they know exactly what they're doing. And it's a very carefully crafted strategy, but let's go.
Math that was done in the early part of the 20th century with people like Roy Teixeira writing about this, talking about how there was this new emerging Democratic majority. It was going to be a majority-minority coalition. As the demographics of the country changed and became less white, inevitably these minority groups would continue to vote at the same rates that they were voting for Democrats. So if you get more Hispanics, you get more black voters, you get more Asian voters, inevitably this would be sort of the new rising wave. And Obama really did model that in 2012. He had a very diverse coalition combined with college-educated white liberals. And so they thought this was going to be the formula here on out, and that was always going to be the formula. And it turns out, the guy who wrote that piece, he came out recently and he said, yeah, I got that completely wrong. It's just not true because the Hispanic vote, it turns out, is malleable. A lot of people who are Hispanic identify as white Hispanic, right? A lot of people who are Hispanic...
Ben Shapiro just said it.
Don't think of themselves primarily in terms of a certain racial identity that dictates politics. They may vote differently. I mean, Cuban Americans don't vote the same way that Venezuelan Americans vote, who don't vote the same way that Mexican Americans vote. The question is whether they're so tied into this sort of intersectional coalition where everybody...
Oh, and just wanted to say, for those of you who don't know, part of the reason for that, as Ben Shapiro alluded to, is that the Latinos who immigrate from different countries tend to be of different races. So, for example, People who come from Mexico tend to be more a mixed race, so there'll be a mix of indigenous, which again is really black and Asian, and then some white, some more recent Asian, that kind of thing. Whereas people who come from Cuba will tend to just be straight up white. Um, I mean, technically they'll have some drops of other things. So a lot of them are Southern Italian. Southern Italians aren't pure white, but basically those people are white. A lot of them are just straight up white, right? So then that affects the voting pattern. Um, yeah.
But is described based on their race, as opposed to a broad platform that anybody can ascribe to no matter what, that they can't get out of that sort of mindset. And it feels like sort of, yeah, I mean, I think that's the disappointment of Biden in some ways. Biden was supposed to be a moderate who was above all that, and he really hasn't governed that way.
Right. And they assimilate quickly.
Also, I think it's pretty funny to, believe that Biden is not a moderate. I mean, on the conservative liberal spectrum, he is very much a moderate. Um, you know, you could even argue he's dead center. So I don't know. He seems to be implying that Biden has been governing like Chairman Mao or something. I really didn't see that at all. But, to the extent Biden's even been governing, that guy's basically a nursing home. But anyway.
Very quickly. And then, they're like, well, I made it, and I'm sorry, but I'm pulling up the ladder. Because if I leave the ladder down, then again, you're going to come in and take my job. And I don't identify that way. I'm an American now. And
I just wanted to also comment on something. Bill Maher touched on something. And again, he's a racist white dude, so I don't know if he sees the implications of it the way I'm about to lay it out. But he is kind of touched on the phenomenon that a lot of immigrants who come here assimilate and then just do not care about giving the same opportunity to other people who might want to immigrate here, right? And part of that has to do with and again, I don't want anyone to misunderstand what I'm about to say. I'm not saying that all immigrants are bad people. I'm not even saying most immigrants are bad people. I come from a family of immigrants. I don't believe that. I'm not saying that there are no valid reasons for someone to immigrate from a more oppressed country to the U.S. I'm not saying that. However, what is unfortunately true is that a large percent of people who immigrate to the U.S. are traitors to their people, right? Because when you look at it on a broader political scale, right, the U.S. is the most powerful white nation on earth, and they oppress every other group of people on earth, right? They're engaged in open, hostile warfare with literally every, non-white group on earth, and to some extent, I mean, they're even oppressing other white groups, right? But that one is not as severe generally. But the point I'm making is the U.S. is really the enemy. Anyone from what you call the third world, the U.S. is your enemy, straight up, right? So then you have a lot of these immigrants who leave their countries that are being ravaged to then go live in the U.S. So in war terms, that's like if your army is getting routed by the opposing army, and in the middle of battle, you pick up all your things and go move into the enemy camp and then start saying, I'm one of these guys, right? So, obviously it's very easy for that to just turn into traitors, and that's what it is in a lot of cases. Now, obviously, as I said before, that's not every case, might not even be most cases, right? Because of the particular dynamics of the particular global war the U.S. is waging, it's very possible For someone to look at their country being ravaged by the U.S., saying, all right, there's no opportunity here. Let me go to the U.S., get some money, and use that money to help my people back home, right? As part of a long-term strategy of liberation. You can do that. Many people are doing that. However, the unfortunate truth is that far too many are doing the opposite. They just get a mentality of, if you can't beat them, just join them. And once they've joined the enemy, they don't want anyone else to, because they don't want their spot taken. Or even just, programming, self-hate is really seeped into their brains, so they just have a natural antipathy to other people from their own group. And to some extent, that with most of those types, I would think that that antipathy probably existed to begin with, which is why, um, one, they even chose to move to the U.S. and not help their own people in the first place. And two, the way the U.S. immigration system works, it selects for the traitors from other countries. One example of this is, if you just look at like the Afghanistan war and the Iraq wars, there's always talk in the media of how the U.S. is helping refugees who helped the U.S. Army, um, but are now being wanted by their people to settle in the U.S. What is that? That's the U.S. helping, um, you know, Afghans and Iraqis who betrayed their own people for the U.S. To then settle in the U.S. and live. That's just one example. There are other more intricate examples of how that works. But that's a very sad and disturbing aspect of immigration that doesn't get talked about enough. And Bill Maher, who touched on it there, so I'll give him credit for that. Even though I don't know if he sees all those implications the exact way I laid it out, because I mean, from his perspective, betraying the countries that and people the U.S. is warring upon in favor of the U.S. probably a good thing. But nonetheless, he did touch on the issue. So let's finish up the clip.
And that's sort of what we want. I can't remember where I read this recently, but somebody wrote an article and said that the Hispanic vote is starting to look a lot like what happened with the Italian vote.
Yep.
Um,
or the Germans, or the Irish, or everybody except the Jews, who just kept voting Democrat forever.
Right.
But yes.
But didn't the Italian become much more of a Republican bloc?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that could happen. And if the Democrats lose that, they're in a lot of trouble. Let's get back into.
Okay. Looks like the video ended there. Ended kind of abruptly. Yeah. Anyway, that video ended more abruptly than. Shit, all right, whatever. Anyway, y'all saw the end of that. So I'll just comment finally on that last segment you saw when Bill Maher was talking about the Italian vote. And then I'll give my overview on the video more generally. Any last thoughts? So the idea that the Hispanic vote is becoming like the Italian vote, I would disagree. I could see where he's coming from. However, again, the big difference is that Hispanics are a lot less white than Italians. Because obviously most of the Italians who came to the U.S., to be fair, were not pure white, because most of them came from southern Italy. If you know the history of southern Italy, you know that most southern Italians have some African and West Asian, ancestry, right? Which is why they're more tan. It's not just some random genetic adaptation. It's just race mixing. They did that. So they're not pure white. However, they're mostly white, overwhelmingly so in their DNA. Not all of them is overwhelming, but the population as a whole, well over 50% white. With Hispanics, it's not necessarily true. They're much less white genetically, and there are many more individuals there who are just maybe not white at all, right? Whereas you can't say that about Italians. So that's gonna affect the degree to which a group can vote Republican. Because at the end of the day, the Republican Party is a white populist party. There are different um, strains of white populism in that party, but it is a white populist party. So to vote for them, you either have to be white or stupid, basically. At least enthusiastically, right? And again, this is not me saying voting for the Democrats is better. They're both, uh, they're both very bad. And all on another channel and some other videos, I'm going to get into more of that. But anyway, without going too deep into that, what I'm saying is that because of how non-white the Hispanic population is, I can't foresee them um, voting as Republican as Ben Shapiro and Bill Maher saying the Italians do. Although I'd like to look into that. I was under the impression that most Italians still voted Democrat, but I could be wrong. But anyway, yeah, I don't think the Hispanic vote will go quite that way. And actually, the results of the last election bore that out. Because even though a lot of noise was made about exit polls that showed that maybe like 50% of Hispanics or something like that voted Republican, when the final numbers came out, the percentage of Hispanics who voted um, Republican wasn't that different than past elections. And most of them still did vote um, Democrat in the end. So I don't see, unless there becomes a large influx of a large and more disproportionate than normal influx of white Hispanics, I don't really see that happening. And the same thing with the other stuff Ben Shapiro said. He talked about how different European groups like Irish, Germans, etc., came over and just started voting Republican. Again, because even those groups are like pure white. Um, because of that, they're gonna have a much easier time getting on board with uh, a white populist agenda, which is what the Republican Party agenda is. Um, so yeah, there's that. But anyway, so those are my thoughts on that last segment. As for my thoughts on the overall video, just to sum it up again, this video actually isn't as irritating as I thought it would be. This is the first video I've done on this channel that I hadn't actually watched before making the video. So this is my first time seeing it. But I just thought, oh, Ben Shapiro, Bill Maher, they're talking about identity politics. I just thought this thing would be, just peak halfway through. It wasn't quite that bad, to be fair to them. They raised some valid points, but again, there was still some very fundamental and very annoyingly ignored, philosophical just the flaws of their argument. I mean, the idea that there is any politics that is not an identity politics is just patently absurd. So there's that again. So this mythology that white people, especially white men, generally like to live in, large percentages of them anyway, that there's no identity politics. I mean, identity politics is really just a dog whistle for any politics that is not a white male politics. Um, again, it's irritating for them to be discussing that without acknowledging that basic point that white men are gonna do what they do. They shouldn't. It's within their being to behave differently, but they're so far gone, they generally tend not to, and I'm not surprised. Yeah, so there's that, and then also they did raise a lot of interesting points about um, the voting trends of different racial and ethnic groups, and I say that in reference to Latinos / Hispanics because It's debatable what you even call that. Certainly not a racial group. You can call it an ethnic group. I don't even like the concept of ethnicity. It's too vague. But anyway, that's that's another video. But yeah, they did raise some interesting points. But again, I think because they failed to fully acknowledge the centrality of um, race and racism as a motivator for people and as an operating principle in society, um, and they weren't able to acknowledge internal white tribal dynamics and how that affects how the Democrats and Republicans operate. I think they missed a lot. But anyway, those are just my thoughts on it. Thank you all again for listening. Coming to you again from my closet. So I guess commentary in the closet, commentary reactions in the closet. I guess it's a thing now. But as usual, please like, subscribe, follow, whatever the platform you're watching on this says. Please share this video with other people you know, and let me know in the comments what you think. So thank you, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.